On the surface, she appears to be a warm, composed, deeply faithful woman. A speaker. An author. A wife. A mother, someone who stands on stages and speaks about God with a calm that most people can only dream of possessing. But behind that calm is a story so devastating, so layered with grief, so filled with unanswerable questions, that even the strongest among us struggle to process it. She lost a child. And then she lost another. Both babies. Both gone. Both diagnosed with the same rare, cruel genetic disorder that offered no hope from the very beginning. And what happened next changed everything. Because instead of collapsing, instead of disappearing into silence, Nancy Guthrie walked toward her pain with open arms. She wrote about it. She spoke about it. She turned grief into ministry, but here's what most people don't know. There are details about Nancy Guthrie's story, 6 specific, chilling, deeply uncomfortable details that raise questions most of us are too afraid to ask. Questions about faith, about loss, about choices made in the shadow of unimaginable heartbreak. Stay with us, because this story is unlike anything you've ever heard. Nancy Guthrie is not a household name in the way that Hollywood celebrities are. She doesn't walk red carpets. She doesn't trend on social media for controversies or fashion choices. She isn't the kind of person whose face appears on magazine covers at airport newsstands. And yet, for hundreds of thousands of people around the world, people who have sat in hospital waiting rooms, people who have buried children, people who have stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m. asking God why, Nancy Guthrie is one of the most important voices they have ever encountered. She is a Bible teacher, a grief author, a podcaster, a woman who has stood at the intersection of profound faith and profound suffering, and refused to look away from either. Her books, including Holding On to Hope and the Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament series, have become lifelines for people drowning in loss. Her podcast, Help Me Teach the Bible, has reached educators and pastors across the globe. She and her husband David co-founded GriefShare, a grief recovery program that has helped millions of people navigate the darkest seasons of their lives. On paper, Nancy Guthrie looks like a success story wrapped in purpose, but the foundation of everything she has built, every book, every stage appearance, every word of comfort she has ever offered, is constructed on something that most people can barely bring themselves to read about, let alone live through. She lost her daughter Hope, a baby girl who lived only 199 days. She lost her son Gabriel, a baby boy who lived only 183 days. Both children were born with Zellweger syndrome, an extraordinarily rare and always fatal metabolic disorder. Both children were held, cherished, and then released. Both deaths were anticipated. Both were devastating beyond any word the English language has the courage to offer. And between those two losses, Nancy and David Guthrie made a decision that shook people to their core. This is the story of Nancy Guthrie. And it is not a simple one. Nancy Guthrie grew up with faith woven into the fabric of her life. She was raised in a Christian household, shaped by the rhythms of church scripture, and the kind of quiet belief that forms slowly in childhood and either deepens or dissolves under the pressure of real life. For Nancy, that faith would be tested in ways most believers never face and most theologians only theorize about from a safe and comfortable distance. As a young woman, she carried the same dreams that so many carry: love, family, a life built on meaning and connection. She met David Guthrie, and together they built something beautiful. They had a son, Matt. Life felt stable, hopeful, ordinary, in the best possible way, but ordinary was not the path that had been laid out for Nancy Guthrie. Few people knew this hidden truth, that beneath the warmth and the composure that would later define her public presence, Nancy was someone who had grown up wrestling with deep questions. Questions about suffering, about why God allows pain, about what faith actually means when life refuses to cooperate with your theology. She didn't know it yet. But those questions were not abstract. They were preparation, because the moment her world cracked open was coming. And nothing, no sermon, no book, no amount of faith carefully stored and tended over a lifetime could fully prepare a mother for what she was about to face. When Hope Guthrie was born in 1999, everything changed. From the very beginning, Doctors delivered news that no parent should ever have to receive. Hope had Zellweger syndrome, a disorder so rare, so devastating, that there was no treatment. No miracle surgery, no clinical trial quietly waiting in the wings. Children born with Zellweger syndrome do not survive long. The brain and vital organs simply cannot sustain themselves. The prognosis was absolute. Hope would live for months. Not years, months. Nancy and David made the agonizing choice to bring Hope home and love her for every single day she had. They fed her. They held her. They sang to her. They documented those days not for the world, but for themselves, because they knew the days were numbered and they needed to hold every last one. Hope. Guthrie lived 199 days. And then she was gone. In the rawness of that grief, Nancy did something extraordinary. She wrote about it. Holding On to Hope was released in 2002, and it landed in the hands of grieving parents, bereaved families, and broken-hearted believers like a letter from someone who truly, completely understood. It was not polished theology delivered from a comfortable distance. It was raw, honest, bone-deep grief shaped carefully into words. That book launched Nancy Guthrie into a world she never auditioned for, the world of public grief ministry. She began speaking. She began teaching. And people came, not because she had answers, but because she had lived inside the questions long enough to show others how to survive them. But what happened next changed everything. Because just when the world thought it understood Nancy Guthrie's story, Chapter 2 began. This is where the 6 chilling details begin. And the first one stops most people cold. After losing hope, Nancy and David Guthrie discovered that both of them carried the recessive gene for Zellweger syndrome. That meant any future biological child they conceived would carry a 1 in 4 chance of being born with the same fatal disorder. 1 in 4. Those are terrifying odds for any couple who has already watched a child count down their days. And yet, Nancy became pregnant again. When Gabriel was born in 2001, he was diagnosed with Zellweger syndrome. Again, the nightmare had returned, wearing the same face. The same disorder. The same prognosis. The same unbearable countdown measured not in years but in weeks. Gabriel Guthrie lived 183 days. And then he too was gone. 2 babies. 2 fatal diagnoses. 2 funerals. The questions this raises are ones that people whisper about rather than say out loud. Why did they conceive again knowing the risk? Was it faith? Was it something more fragile than faith? Was it the deep human hunger for life in the face of death? Nancy has addressed this. She has spoken and written about the decision with honesty and openness. But the rawness of the question, the weight of it, never fully disappears. After Gabriel died, Nancy and David made a permanent decision. David had a vasectomy. It was not a decision born of anger or despair, but of clear-eyed, heartbroken recognition. They could not survive losing another child. They would not put themselves or another baby through that again. For some within deeply conservative religious communities, that decision was controversial. It ignited theological debates about sterilization, about trusting God with the direction of a family, about where human choice ends and divine sovereignty begins. Nancy did not hide from those questions, but neither did they quietly disappear. Then came another layer of discomfort. Nancy built an entire public ministry on her grief, and some people, in the corners of online religious discourse, questioned whether that was appropriate. Whether grief should become a platform. Whether suffering, however genuine, should generate a career. It is an uncomfortable question. But it is a real one, and it deserves to be acknowledged rather than dismissed. GriefShare, the program Nancy and David co-founded, is used in thousands of churches across the world. But it operates from a distinctly Christian theological framework. For grieving people who do not share that framework, that exclusivity carries its own quiet, unspoken tension. And then there is perhaps the most chilling detail of all. Nancy Guthrie, a woman so publicly identified with faith, so deeply trusted as a voice of theological steadiness, has admitted in her most honest moments that she does not always feel at peace with the answers she holds, that she believes God allowed the deaths of her children for purposes she cannot fully see. But that believing something and feeling settled about it are 2 entirely different things. That admission, that raw, Unguarded uncertainty from a woman the world looks to for spiritual clarity unsettles people more than anything else about her story, because it refuses to let any of us off the hook. It forces us to ask what we actually believe when the lights go off. And the easy answers have run out. Behind every public word Nancy Guthrie has ever spoken is a private woman who has known depths of grief that most of us will never touch. She and David have spoken about the strain that losing 2 children placed on their marriage. Grief is isolating even inside the closest partnership. 2 people can love each other with everything they have and still grieve on entirely different timelines, in entirely different rooms of the same heart. There were seasons, Nancy has admitted, where she felt completely alone even when David was right beside her, where the love between them was real and present, and still somehow not enough to reach her in the place where the pain lived. She has spoken about the specific, suffocating agony of anticipatory grief, knowing a child will die, watching the days count down, holding love and loss simultaneously in the same pair of arms. It is a particular kind of endurance that has no precise name and no adequate preparation. She has also spoken about the complicated, tender experience of raising their surviving son Matt in the shadow of 2 lost siblings, of protecting him while also being honest, of building a family identity that honored Hope and Gabriel without allowing absence to become the only defining feature of their home. Those conversations, intimate, painful, deeply human, are perhaps the most important things Nancy Guthrie has ever shared publicly, because they remind us that she is not a grief expert performing composure for an audience. She is a mother who buried 2 of her children and kept getting up every single morning anyway. Time has a way of changing what grief looks like without ever erasing what grief is. Nancy Guthrie has grown older alongside her loss. Hope and Gabriel remain forever frozen at 199 days and 183 days respectively. But Nancy has continued to age, to change, to learn, carrying them forward into every year they never got to see. In interviews over the years, she has reflected on how her theology of suffering has evolved, how the answers that once felt sufficient have become more textured, more complicated, more honest, how certainty has given way not to doubt, but to something more mature, a willingness to hold mystery without demanding that it resolve itself on her schedule. She has said that she no longer reaches for easy theological explanations when she encounters someone in pain. She has learned, through the hard school of lived experience, that the most powerful thing she can offer is not an answer but a presence, a willingness to sit in the darkness alongside someone without rushing them toward a light they aren't ready for. That shift from teacher to companion is one of the most profound and quiet transformations. In her entire public ministry, she has become increasingly focused on helping others teach Scripture with depth and integrity, recognizing that the next generation of believers needs not just comfort but substance. Her podcasts and speaking work reflect a woman who has moved from survivor to builder, from the one who was carried to the one who helps carry others, but privately, she has acknowledged that certain anniversaries still crack her open, that the grief is not gone, that it has simply become something she carries with more practiced hands, still heavy but no longer surprising in its weight. So what are the 6 chilling details really about? They are not about scandal in any tabloid sense. They are not about hidden crimes or shocking betrayals whispered behind closed doors. They are chilling in a much quieter, much more disturbing way. They are chilling because they force every single one of us to sit inside questions that refuse clean answers. Why would 2 people who love God and love each other conceive again, knowing those odds? Why do we feel strangely unsettled watching someone build a meaningful public life from private tragedy? What does that discomfort actually reveal about us and our own relationship with grief and purpose? And why does Nancy Guthrie's admission that she doesn't always feel at peace, that she holds the mystery without having solved it, feel more disturbing than a confident declaration of certainty ever would? Perhaps because we want our grief stories to arrive with clean endings. We want the suffering to have produced something permanent and sure. We want Nancy Guthrie to stand before us completely healed, completely certain, completely at rest with everything that happened. And she doesn't. She stands before us human. That is the real revelation at the center of everything. Nancy Guthrie never claimed to have conquered grief. She claimed to have walked through it carrying her faith the way you carry something, irreplaceable through a storm, carefully, imperfectly, but without ever fully letting go. The chilling details are not evidence of failure, they are evidence of what it actually costs to live honestly inside the deepest, most unrelenting pain a human being can know. There is a version of Nancy Guthrie's story that gets told in 2 minutes. 2 sick babies. A grieving mother. She wrote a book. She found meaning. End scene. But that version does no justice to the woman, the loss, or the questions her life insists on raising. The real story is slower, harder, more unresolved. It is the story of a woman who chose to remain present inside her pain instead of escaping it, who chose honesty over performance, even when performance would have been so much easier and so much safer, who chose to keep speaking even when she wasn't certain of the answers, because she understood that silence would not serve the people sitting in their own darkness waiting for someone to walk in beside them. Nancy Guthrie did not turn her grief into a brand, she turned it into a bridge between those who are suffering and those who have survived suffering, between faith and doubt, between the clean promises of theology and the messy, beautiful, heartbreaking reality of being human inside a world that does not always make sense. Hope lived 199 days. Gabriel lived 183 days. Together, they lived less than a single year. And yet the ripple of their lives, through their mother's words, through grief share, through every book quietly pressed into a grieving parent's trembling hands, has reached millions of people across the world. That is not a chilling detail. That is something much closer to a miracle. And perhaps that is the deepest truth Nancy Guthrie has ever offered us. That the things in life which raise the most questions are often the very same things that carry the most meaning. That grief does not have to be resolved to be transformative. That a life marked by loss can still, and perhaps most powerfully of all, be a life unmistakably marked by love.